Jan continued her work in property management and involved me from time to time. A tenant in the Chilwell house was difficult from the start, complaining about everything and nothing. Even his neighbours had had enough of him and asked when he was going to move on. He rang to complain that the shelf under the kitchen sink had collapsed under the weight of cleaning materials. He was not prepared to fix it, so I called in on my way to Chapeltown and fitted a 4-inch length of 2x2 under the shelf. So simple. As I was doing this, I heard his young daughter saying to him, "Daddy, I won't climb into the cupboard again." While in Chapeltown, I drove to Rotherham to visit Kathleen and Anthony. It was very stormy, leaves blowing everywhere, and the sound of fireworks all around. Then suddenly, like in a nightmare, a horse came out of the dark, heading straight towards the car. I applied the brakes, and the animal veered off across the road. As I began to sigh with relief, another horse appeared from the left, and crossing in front of the car, followed the first one into a public park. I'm still not quite certain whether or not I dreamt it all. Thieves stole 40 Pamet tiles from the floor of Stockton Church's porch, but they were apprehended when the tradesman who they tried to sell them to, at £7 each, became suspicious and rang the police. We were not able to collect our tiles as they were needed for evidence, so in the meantime Bill Marvin, who had recently moved into Stockton Old Rectory opposite the church, kindly said he would lay some slabs in the porch as a temporary measure. Bishop David, the new Bishop of Thetford, came to Geldeston to consecrate the new graveyard extension. We set the time for this at 6 p.m, and it was getting quite dark as we walked over the ground. The final prayers were said by torchlight. 4 days later, Shirley Warner was the first person to be buried there. Shirley, who had fought against leukemia for 8 years. At the Geldeston carol service, Jan, in the choir, noticed that Johnny Crowfoot's surplice had brushed a candle and caught fire. Her prompt action to put out this with her music folder probably saved him from getting nastily burnt.
All of me, why not take all of me? Can't you see I'm no good without you? Take my lips, I wanna lose them. Take my arms, I'll never use them. Your goodbye left me with eyes that cry. How can I go on, dear, without you? You took the part that once was my heart, so why not take all of me? Tell me it's lazy, tell me slow, tell me I'm crazy, maybe I know. Can't help loving that man of mine. When he goes away, that's a rainy day. And when he comes back, the day is fine. There's someone me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, darling, kiss me. Fill my heart with song and let me sing forevermore. You are all I long for, all I worship and adore. In other words, please be true. In other words, I love you.
to get away, take a holiday from the neighborhood, hop a flight to Miami Beach out of Hollywood. But I'm taking a Greyhound on the Hudson River line. I'm in a New York state of mind. I've seen all the movie stars in the fancy
fancy cars and a limousine. Been high in the Rockies under the evergreens, but I know what I'm needing, and I don't want to waste more time. I'm in a New York state of mind.
Our tenant at 18 Cadiz Way stopped paying his rent. Jan and I went to investigate and found that he was not at the house, but the back door was wide open and 2 dogs, for which he had not asked permission, were running around the house. We put a note through the letterbox saying that we would meet him at the house in a week's time unless we heard otherwise. Having heard nothing, we drove over to Hopton, and he was not there. But we did have a vague idea of his daughter's address in Geldeston. The front door was answered by a woman and 2 dogs, one of which was immediately recognisable as our tenant's dog, and as being the spitting image of the Simpsons' rescue dog, Santa's Little Helper, with exactly the same pleased to see you expression on its face. At that moment he drove up in a BMW car and was quite surprised to see us. He promised to bring the rent owing the following Tuesday, but surprisingly he did not keep his promise. In the new year, Jan and I spent a day at Cadiz Way dismantling the furniture left behind by our tenant, taking an estate car full of collapsed units to the dump in Lowestoft. In the garden, Jan discovered a washing up bowl with 2 frogs hibernating, the same 2 who had been living in the garden since we bought the house in 1997. Then, having cleaned the house, we cleared rubbish out of the back garden, painted the outside doors and windowsills, leaving the keys with neighbours, who had agreed to close the doors and windows when the paint had dried. We visited the house for a further 4 days, varnishing doors, painting the gas fire that our tenant had damaged, vacuuming carpets, scrubbing the bathroom, mowing lawns, replacing broken power points, etc. A few people expressed interest in renting the house. We decided on a retired couple who laid a new carpet and decorated the house. At last, some good tenants who have remained with us for nearly 20 years. Jan persuaded me to go with her to Geldeston to try and track down our former tenant. We discovered which road he was living on, and then which house in the road, due to the presence of a red BMW car with a personalised number plate outside. However, still, no money was forthcoming. At a group service, a man named David Bulkley came to talk about the work of Gideon's International. It turned out that he was the nephew of Mr. Bulkley, from whom we purchased cedar gates in the Isle of Man. The Round Tower Society visited Stockton and Kirby Cane churches to lecture on the buildings. 60 people came. One memorable moment occurred at Kirby Cane Church when the expert pointed to the face of a young woman carved into the stone of the font. He said, "The hairstyles of women in the 14th century regularly changed. That hairstyle indicates that this font was carved in 1368. Not only such an accurate dating, but here probably was a portrait of a person who had lived at that time." I tutored the bereavement counselling course, They Shall Be Comforted, at Bressingham for 4 weeks. With the rector, Bob Mellowship, there were 15 participants. They presented me with 2 good quality bottles of red wine at the end. I did enjoy leading courses such as this as part of my contribution to the work of the diocese, rather than being a rural dean, for instance. We organised a party for Jim and Mo Sawyer, who had contributed so much to parish and community life, and who were now moving to Lincolnshire. I gave the speech. It has been noticed by clergy for many years that men take a far less active part in church life than women. Someone has suggested that we might therefore change the words of the well-known hymn from "Take my life and let it be" to "Take my wife and let me be." Jim Sawyer, however, has proved the exception to this rule, as he and Mo have contributed so much to the life of this community. Anne Barber organised special events for the children and their parents. The first of these was a teddy bear parachute from the tower of Geldeston Church. It was a lovely day, and the 60 or so people who came picnicked around the foot of the tower as their bears descended. Drove the Mondeo to Chapeltown on the Friday and then took Mum and Dad on to Geldeston on the Saturday. There we met Paul's train from Bristol and made our way to the boatyard. At 3:30 one night I was woken up by the sound of what I thought might be swans arguing, and went back to sleep. Then Dad appeared to say that Caroline had broken her finger in a door hinge during some horseplay. I went over immediately to find a very drunk Caroline telling everyone, "Don't worry, we can call for an ambulance in the morning." The top of her finger was black, bone was exposed, and part seems to be hanging off. So from an OS map, I gave our position to the man at ambulance control, and then Andrew and I made our way to Bridge 120 to meet the ambulance. With the paramedic, we made our way back to the boats. After performing some first aid, Elizabeth went with Caroline and the paramedic to Burnley Hospital. One day we dressed as our respective Narnian characters. As I was the badger truffle hunter, Margaret painted the black and white stripes on my face, to which I added a badger mask. A few puns came to mind. On the eve of All Saints' Day, Bishop David of Thetford visited Geldeston Church to confirm 9 candidates who had been attending discussion groups at the rectory since Easter. Before leaving the house for clergy prayers, I opened a letter with an Anglia Television in Southampton letterhead. It began, "Dear Mr. Whiteman, in the autumn we are presenting a series of 3 programmes entitled Eastern Angles, featuring the church building, minister and congregation of 3 of Norfolk's oldest churches. Apparently, with the permission of the Bishop of Norwich, a production team was planning to follow me over a fortnight with the aim of making an hour-long TV programme about Stockton Church for a series entitled Eastern Angles. My heart immediately sank at the thought. It would involve putting on a show, renting a congregation and appearing on television. This letter arrived on April the 1st and I wasn't sure for a few hours whether or not it was an April Fool joke. Later on, Jan admitted that she had been the culprit, having found the letter heading in a drawer at school. I conducted a wedding blessing at Ellingham Hall for the son of Colonel Smith, who had married a Muslim girl from Bosnia. They had met there while he was working as a reporter. A few years later, he brought Julian Assange to Ellingham Hall as a refuge after he had released sensitive documents onto the internet. From there he moved into the Ecuadorian embassy for sanctuary so as to avoid deportation to the USA. On Remembrance Sunday, Bishop David visited the benefice to meet the church wardens and to talk with me. In the services, the names of the fallen were read out by representatives from each of the parishes. After the bishop had met with the church wardens over coffee at Kirby Kane Memorial Hall, Jan and I went with him to Ellingham Hall to have lunch with Colonel Smith, whose first question was, "Who was that long, thin individual leading the choir? Is he queer?" Oh dear. Like Harry Enfield and Paul Whitehouse, I had already come across other army officers asking the same question. It was common to hear from the owners of manorial halls that they would not give money to the parish share and thereby provide stipends for queer bishops. Oh dear. After 10 years in the Waveney group, Jan and I decided to apply for the post of rector of the Culworth benefice and were duly invited with 3 other candidates for interview on the 16th of December 2003. Jan and I went away wanting the job, but not really expecting to be offered it. The following morning, after a walk, we noticed that Bishop Frank had rung. I returned the call, heart in mouth, and he offered me the post of rector in the Culworth benefice. Jan and I were delighted. In a follow-up letter confirming this, Bishop Frank wrote, "It gives me great pleasure to write to you for the patrons of the Culworth benefice to offer you the opportunity to become rector. You are one of a field of high calibre candidates, and the patrons are delighted to offer you this appointment following careful discussion with the parish representatives after the interviews." Next I went on a tour of the Waveney group of parishes and the church wardens to tell them in confidence the news. The move could only become public knowledge when the Criminal Records Bureau check had been completed and a Sunday to make the announcement had been fixed. Neville Pilling, my colleague and friend at the Isle of Man College of Further Education, was diagnosed with colon cancer a few months earlier and underwent what was thought to be a successful operation. Dorothy, his wife, rang to tell us that he had died following the discovery of liver cancer, and to tell us that his funeral was taking place the following day. Francis and Philip Mitchell called Jan and I to go round to their new home in Beccles, where, while building an extension, bones were discovered in the ground. The police had been called, but soon decided that there was nothing sinister to worry about, as this had been the site of a very old graveyard. So I conducted a short service of reinterment into the foundations of their extension. We visited Culworth Rectory to find that the house was full of damp, water on the kitchen floor, and damp patches on many walls. The Archdeacon and diocesan surveyor agreed to new flooring and carpets and new units in the kitchen. This month saw the final round of clergy and church meetings. Jan and I were invited to dinner by Johnny and Tanya Crowfoot. We gave our wooden octagonal pond to Ellingham School for their new nature garden, and I received presentations from both schools at my final assemblies, cards, book tokens, and a cherry blossom tree for our new garden.